The American Revolution. How America won its independence. The end of an empire's golden age, 1763 to 1765. In 1763, the 7 Years' War came to an end. Britain emerged as the world's dominant imperial power, defeating both France and Spain in a conflict that stretched across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and beyond. The victory dramatically reshaped the map of the world. France surrendered nearly all of its North American possessions, while Britain gained control of vast new territories stretching from Canada to the Mississippi River. Together with its holdings in India and the Caribbean, the British Empire had become larger than ever before, so vast that people proudly claimed the sun never set upon it. Yet beneath the celebrations lay a dangerous problem. Victory had come at an enormous price. Years of war had left Britain buried under a mountain of debt. Interest payments alone consumed more than half of the government's annual budget. At the same time, these newly acquired lands required thousands of soldiers to defend them from hostile Native American tribes and from European rivals eager for revenge. Almost immediately, Britain's fears proved justified. In 1763, Pontiac, the influential Odawa leader, united several Native American nations in a widespread uprising against British rule. Frontier forts west of the Appalachian Mountains were attacked one after another, reminding Britain that conquest did not guarantee peace. But the greatest challenge facing the empire would not come from foreign enemies. It would come from Britain's own colonies. More than 150 years had passed since England established its first permanent settlement in North America. By the mid-1700s, Britain possessed 26 colonies across North America and the Caribbean. 13 of those colonies lined the Atlantic coast and were experiencing remarkable growth. Their combined population had surpassed 1 million people. Although they shared British rule, the colonies were anything but identical. Each colony had its own history, economy, government, and religious traditions. Massachusetts had been founded largely by Puritans seeking religious freedom. Maryland became a refuge for English Catholics. Pennsylvania flourished under the leadership of Quakers. Elsewhere, ambitious settlers crossed the Atlantic searching for farmland, wealth, and opportunity. Many succeeded. Many others arrived with little more than hope. Some came as indentured servants. Others arrived against their will. Slavery existed legally throughout all 13 colonies. In the northern colonies, enslaved Africans made up only a small percentage of the population. In the South, however, plantation agriculture depended almost entirely upon slave labor. Massive estates produced tobacco, rice, and indigo for export across the Atlantic. In Virginia, nearly 40% of the population was enslaved. In South Carolina, that number reached almost 60%. The colonies were also becoming increasingly diverse. While earlier generations had been overwhelmingly English, new waves of immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, and the German states transformed colonial society. Together they created something that was beginning to feel distinctly American. Visitors frequently remarked that Americans appeared more independent, more entrepreneurial, and less tied to traditional British customs than people living in England itself. The connection to the mother country was slowly changing. For decades, Britain had largely allowed its colonies to govern themselves. Historians often describe this policy as salutary neglect. As long as trade remained profitable and the colonies remained loyal, London rarely interfered in local affairs. Colonial assemblies passed their own laws. Local leaders managed taxes. Communities developed according to their own needs. Britain focused its attention elsewhere, particularly on the immensely profitable sugar islands of the Caribbean and its expanding empire in India. After the 7 Years' War, however, that policy could no longer continue. The government desperately needed money. Many British politicians believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense. From London's perspective, the argument seemed perfectly reasonable. Compared with ordinary people living in Britain, American colonists paid remarkably little in taxes. One estimate suggested that while the average British citizen paid around 26 shillings in taxes each year, a resident of New England paid only a single shilling. The difference was enormous. If Britain had sacrificed blood and treasure defending North America, surely the colonies could contribute something in return. The question was not whether taxes should be collected. It was how, and that question would change history. Prime Minister George Grenville believed Britain's financial crisis required immediate action. In 1764, his government introduced new measures designed to raise revenue from the colonies. The first was the Sugar Act. Rather than dramatically increasing taxes, it actually reduced certain duties on imported sugar and molasses while strengthening enforcement against smuggling. The second proposal proved far more controversial. The Stamp Act required official tax stamps on newspapers, legal documents, business contracts, licenses, pamphlets, playing cards, and numerous other printed materials. To British lawmakers, these taxes seemed modest. People in Britain had paid similar taxes for generations. No one expected serious resistance. Instead, the colonies erupted. The Stamp Act affected lawyers, printers, merchants, publishers, and businessmen, the educated and influential members of colonial society. Newspapers condemned the legislation. Pamphlets spread throughout the colonies. Public meetings denounced Parliament's actions. Critics argued that the issue was not simply money, it was liberty. Colonists insisted they could not legally be taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. Their rallying cry quickly spread from town to town: no taxation without representation. They argued that as British subjects, they possessed the same constitutional rights enjoyed by citizens living in Britain itself. Prime Minister Grenville rejected the criticism. He claimed that Americans already enjoyed what he called virtual representation. According to his reasoning, every member of Parliament represented the interests of the entire British Empire, including people who had never voted. Since many ordinary Britons themselves lacked voting rights, Grenville believed the colonies were being treated no differently. Few Americans accepted the argument. Even within Parliament, many questioned its logic. One of the government's most powerful critics was former Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder. He openly challenged the idea that Americans were represented in Parliament. Who, he asked, actually spoke for the colonies? Which member had ever been elected by the American people? His answer was simple: none. Pitt argued that Parliament possessed no moral right to tax the colonies without their consent. His speeches inspired many Americans and strengthened colonial resistance. By 1765, opposition had spread across British America. The road toward revolution had begun. Resistance becomes a movement 1765 to 1767. The Stamp Act quickly transformed scattered frustration into organized resistance across the colonies. Throughout 1765, colonial legislatures met to determine how they should respond to Britain's latest attempt to impose direct taxation. Among the loudest voices was a relatively unknown lawyer from Virginia named Patrick Henry. Speaking before the Virginia House of Burgesses, Henry argued that the rights of the colonists were no different from those of any other British citizen. Their ancestors, he reminded fellow lawmakers, had crossed the Atlantic carrying with them all the liberties guaranteed under English law. Those rights, he insisted, could not simply disappear because they now lived in America. Henry introduced a series of resolutions declaring that only Virginia's elected representatives possessed the legal authority to tax the people of Virginia. Any attempt by Parliament to do otherwise threatened the very foundations of constitutional government. His words electrified the Assembly. Many younger delegates applauded his courage. Others were horrified. To conservative lawmakers, Henry had crossed a dangerous line. Questioning Parliament's authority sounded alarmingly close to questioning the authority of the Crown itself. After fierce debate, some of Henry's strongest resolutions were removed. Yet, copies of the original version soon circulated throughout the colonies, making Patrick Henry one of the best-known defenders of colonial rights. Among those watching these events unfold was a brilliant young legal clerk named Thomas Jefferson, who would later become one of the leading voices of the American Revolution. As political arguments intensified, protests spread from legislative chambers into the streets. Across the colonies, crowds targeted the officials responsible for enforcing the Stamp Act. Tax collectors were threatened, assaulted, or forced to resign before the law could even take effect. Effigies of royal officials were hung from trees and burned before cheering crowds. Government offices were attacked. Tax documents were destroyed. Public demonstrations became increasingly organized and increasingly bold. In many towns, large trees became known as Liberty Trees, serving as gathering places where citizens met to protest British rule. These dramatic acts of resistance carried a clear message. If Britain insisted on enforcing unpopular taxes, the colonies would make that task nearly impossible. While demonstrations filled the streets, colonial leaders sought a united political response. In October 1765, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies gathered in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. Although each colony had its own government and interests, representatives agreed on several fundamental principles. They reaffirmed their loyalty to King George III. They declared that Americans remained faithful British subjects, but they also insisted that taxation required the consent of the people being taxed. Since the colonies elected no representatives to Parliament, Parliament had no constitutional right to impose internal taxes upon them. The delegates drafted respectful petitions to both the King and Parliament, hoping reason would succeed where protests might fail. At the same time, merchants throughout the colonies organized widespread boycotts of British goods. Stores refused to import many products from Britain. Consumers deliberately avoided British-made merchandise whenever possible. The economic consequences soon reached London. British manufacturers watched orders disappear. Merchants complained of collapsing exports. Powerful business interests began pressuring Parliament to reconsider the controversial legislation. By early 1766, Britain's government faced a difficult reality. The Stamp Act had produced far more resistance than revenue. Collecting the tax had become practically impossible. A new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, concluded that maintaining the law simply was not worth the political and economic damage it was causing. Parliament voted to repeal both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. Across the colonies, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Bonfires filled town squares. Many Americans believed they had successfully defended their constitutional rights while remaining loyal subjects of the British Crown. It seemed as though the crisis had ended, but appearances proved deceiving. On the very same day Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it passed another law with far-reaching consequences, the Declaratory Act. This legislation stated that Parliament possessed full authority to make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. Britain had withdrawn the taxes. It had not surrendered the principle behind them. Parliament still claimed complete legislative authority over colonial affairs. Many colonial leaders immediately recognized the warning. The immediate dispute had been resolved. The larger constitutional conflict had not. Another confrontation seemed inevitable. Their fears proved correct almost immediately. In 1767, Britain's new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, introduced another series of taxes aimed at raising revenue from the colonies. Unlike the Stamp Act, these duties focused on imported goods such as glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Known collectively as the Townshend Acts, the measures also strengthened customs enforcement and expanded the power of British officials in America. Once again, colonial opposition exploded. Merchants revived non-importation agreements. Public meetings condemned Parliament's actions. Crowds harassed customs officers and royal administrators. Some officials were covered in hot tar and feathers before being paraded through the streets, a brutal public punishment designed to intimidate anyone cooperating with British authority. As the movement grew, political identities became increasingly defined. Those who actively opposed British policies began calling themselves patriots. Those who believed the colonies should remain loyal to Britain became known as loyalists. Many families, communities, and lifelong friendships soon found themselves divided between these two competing visions of America's future. Among the most influential patriot organizations was a group called the Sons of Liberty. Led by Samuel Adams, its members included prominent figures such as merchant John Hancock, physician Joseph Warren, and silversmith Paul Revere. Through speeches, newspapers, public meetings, and organized protests, they helped transform local resistance into a coordinated movement that stretched across the colonies. By the end of 1767, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies had changed forever. The debate was no longer simply about taxes. It had become a struggle over political authority, constitutional rights, and the future of the British Empire itself. Neither side was willing to surrender, and with every new law passed in London, the path toward revolution became increasingly difficult to avoid. From protests to bloodshed, 1770-1774. By the end of the 1760s, tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached a dangerous new level. Nowhere was the conflict more intense than in Boston. The city had become the heart of patriot resistance. British customs officials struggled to enforce Parliament's laws, while angry crowds regularly protested against royal authority. To restore order, Britain stationed thousands of soldiers in Boston in 1768. Instead of calming the situation, their presence only made matters worse. Citizens resented seeing armed troops patrolling their streets. Arguments between soldiers and civilians became almost routine. Both sides viewed the other with growing suspicion. Everyone sensed that violence was only a matter of time. That moment arrived on the evening of March 5, 1770. What began as a small confrontation outside the customs house quickly escalated. A group of Bostonians surrounded several British soldiers, shouting insults and daring them to fire. Snowballs packed with ice, stones, and other objects flew through the air. The soldiers, heavily outnumbered and under enormous pressure, struggled to maintain control. Then, amid the confusion, a single gunshot rang out. No one knew exactly who fired first. Within seconds, the British soldiers unleashed a volley into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. The incident immediately became known as the Boston Massacre. For Patriot leaders, it was a propaganda victory unlike anything before. Paul Revere produced an engraving portraying disciplined British soldiers deliberately firing into a peaceful crowd. Pamphlets and newspapers spread the story throughout the colonies. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the emotional impact. For many Americans, British troops were no longer protectors, they were occupiers. Samuel Savage, a Boston resident, wrote in his diary that March 5th should never be forgotten. The bloodshed convinced many colonists that peaceful coexistence was becoming increasingly unlikely. Despite the outrage, there were still influential figures determined to prevent war. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson ordered British troops removed from central Boston to reduce tensions. The soldiers involved in the shooting were placed on trial. Ironically, one of the lawyers who defended them was John Adams, a committed patriot who believed every person deserved a fair trial. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. Only 2 were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The verdict demonstrated that, despite rising political passions, many colonists still respected the rule of law. Meanwhile, events in Britain were also changing. A new Prime Minister, Lord North, took office. Determined to restore stability, he repealed nearly all of the townshend duties. Only one tax remained, the tax on tea. Although financially insignificant, it carried enormous symbolic importance. Parliament refused to abandon its claim that it possessed the authority to tax the colonies whenever it chose. For a time, tensions eased. Boycotts weakened. Trade slowly recovered. Many hoped the worst had passed, but beneath the surface, resentment continued to grow. In New England, merchants remained deeply frustrated by Britain's trade regulations. Imperial laws restricted commerce with foreign nations and limited colonial economic freedom. Many successful businessmen, including John Hancock, profited through smuggling, importing goods, while avoiding British customs duties. British officials intensified efforts to stop illegal trade. Royal Navy ships searched colonial vessels. Cargoes were confiscated. Suspected smugglers were increasingly tried in vice admiralty courts rather than local courts, where sympathetic colonial juries often refused to convict. To many Americans, these special courts represented another attack on their traditional rights. Resistance became more aggressive. In 1772, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded the British customs schooner HMS Gaspee, attacked the crew, and burned the ship to the waterline. The conflict had moved well beyond petitions and speeches. Open acts of defiance against British authority were becoming increasingly common. While unrest continued in America, Britain faced a financial crisis of its own. The powerful East India Company, one of the largest commercial enterprises in the world, stood on the brink of bankruptcy. To rescue the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. The new law allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the American colonies without many of the normal taxes paid in Britain. As a result, its tea would actually become cheaper than much of the smuggled tea sold by colonial merchants. Yet one small tax remained. Only 3 pence per pound. Financially, it was almost insignificant. Politically, it changed everything. Many patriots argued that purchasing the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The issue was no longer the price. It was the principle. As shipments carrying hundreds of tons of tea crossed the Atlantic, patriot organizations pressured colonial merchants to reject them. In Philadelphia and several other ports, angry crowds forced tea ships to turn back before unloading their cargo. Boston, however, proved different. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to leave without paying the required duty. The confrontation reached its breaking point. On a cold December evening in 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans. The disguise symbolized what many patriots increasingly believed. They were no longer simply British colonists. They were becoming Americans. Boarding 3 East India Company ships, they worked with remarkable discipline. No property was damaged except the tea itself. One by one, they smashed open 340 chests and dumped their contents into Boston Harbor. Nearly 92,000 pounds of tea disappeared beneath the icy water. The event became forever known as the Boston Tea Party. To patriots, it represented a courageous act of resistance against tyranny. John Adams praised it as a bold and unforgettable demonstration of public determination. He believed great causes required dramatic actions that people would remember for generations. The British government saw something entirely different. From London's perspective, this was not peaceful protest. It was organized criminal destruction of private property. Parliament concluded that compromise had gone too far. The time for restraint was over. In the spring of 1774, Britain struck back. Determined to make an example of Massachusetts, Parliament passed a series of harsh laws that became known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. Americans would remember them by another name. The Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea had been paid for. Massachusetts' system of self-government was severely restricted. Royal officials received greater protection from colonial courts. British troops gained expanded authority to occupy buildings when necessary. At nearly the same time, Parliament also approved the Quebec Act, enlarging the province of Quebec and officially recognizing the rights of French Catholics. Although intended to stabilize Canada, many Protestant colonists interpreted the law as yet another threat to their liberties and western expansion. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain's punishment united the colonies. Communities from Georgia to New Hampshire organized aid for Boston. Legislatures passed resolutions condemning Parliament's actions. What had begun years earlier as scattered protests against taxation was rapidly becoming a continental movement. For many Americans, the struggle was no longer about a few unpopular laws. It had become a fight over who possessed the right to govern America itself. And for the first time, thousands of colonists began preparing for a possibility that once seemed unthinkable: war. The first shots of revolution, 1774 April 1775. Britain had hoped that the intolerable acts would isolate Massachusetts and force the rebellious colony into submission. Instead, they achieved the exact opposite. Across North America, many colonists concluded that if Parliament could strip away the rights of Massachusetts, no colony was truly safe. Support poured into Boston. Food, money, and supplies arrived from neighboring colonies, while local assemblies condemned what they described as another example of parliamentary tyranny. For the first time, Americans began thinking not simply as citizens of separate colonies, but as people sharing a common cause. Virginia quickly emerged as one of Massachusetts' strongest supporters. When the Virginia House of Burgesses expressed solidarity with Boston, Royal Governor Lord Dunmore responded by dissolving the assembly. Rather than ending the protest, his decision only strengthened colonial resistance. Virginia's political leaders simply gathered elsewhere and continued their discussions independently. One of the most influential meetings took place in Fairfax County, where local landowner George Washington presided over the proceedings. Only a decade earlier, few colonists had openly questioned Parliament's authority. Now the language had become dramatically more radical. The Fairfax Resolves declared that because Americans could not elect representatives to Parliament, only their own provincial assemblies possessed the legitimate authority to make laws for the colonies. If Parliament continued claiming unlimited power over America, the resolutions warned, it would create one of the greatest systems of tyranny ever imposed upon a free people. The colonies were moving steadily away from compromise. As similar calls echoed throughout British America, colonial leaders agreed that a united response was essential. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. For the first time in history, representatives from nearly all of Britain's mainland colonies met under one roof to coordinate their response. Among those attending were some of the most influential figures of the coming revolution. John Adams and Samuel Adams represented Massachusetts, bringing first-hand experience of Britain's crackdown in Boston. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania favored reconciliation and hoped the crisis could still be resolved peacefully. Patrick Henry of Virginia represented a far more radical position, believing that complete independence might eventually become unavoidable. Despite their differences, the delegates reached an important compromise. They agreed to organize a unified boycott of British goods until the intolerable acts were repealed. They also drafted another respectful petition to King George III, reaffirming their loyalty while pleading for justice. The delegates insisted that they desired peace, liberty, and security, not rebellion. They promised that they wished to preserve their connection with Great Britain if their constitutional rights could be restored. Unfortunately, their appeal would never receive the response they hoped for. Although the Congress failed to solve the political crisis, it accomplished something equally significant. It proved that the colonies could cooperate. Delegates who had once viewed themselves primarily as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians increasingly began seeing themselves as Americans. Friendships formed, ideas spread rapidly. A shared identity slowly emerged. Many left Philadelphia believing that if future challenges arose, the colonies would stand together once again. While politicians debated, preparations for war quietly accelerated. Nearly every colony maintained its own militia made up of ordinary citizens. These part-time soldiers began drilling more frequently, stockpiling weapons, and organizing themselves under experienced local officers. British commanders watched these developments with growing concern. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America and military governor of Massachusetts, understood the danger. Thousands of armed colonists surrounded Boston. Even more worrying were the large stores of gunpowder and weapons scattered throughout the countryside. Whoever controlled those supplies would hold a major advantage if fighting ever began. In September 1774, Gage dispatched soldiers to secure a gunpowder depot outside Boston. The operation itself succeeded without violence. Rumors, however, spread far faster than the troops. Stories raced across Massachusetts claiming British soldiers had attacked villages, massacred civilians, and bombarded Boston from the sea. None of these reports were true, yet within hours, thousands of armed patriots were marching toward Boston, convinced that war had already begun. Although the crisis passed peacefully, everyone recognized how close disaster had come. Neither side fully trusted the other anymore. Throughout the winter, General Gage concentrated his forces inside Boston and strengthened the city's defenses. At the same time, he requested reinforcements from Britain. Parliament hesitated. Britain's army remained relatively small, and transporting thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic required enormous expense. Meanwhile, colonial resistance continued to grow stronger with every passing month. By early 1775, Parliament officially declared that Massachusetts was in open rebellion. The possibility of peaceful compromise was rapidly disappearing. On March 23, 1775, delegates gathered once again in Virginia. There, Patrick Henry delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. He argued that every peaceful attempt to resolve the crisis had failed. Petitions had been ignored. Appeals to justice had accomplished nothing. British armies continued preparing for war. To Henry, there was only one remaining choice. Either Americans would defend their liberty or they would surrender it forever. He ended with words that echoed throughout the colonies. "Give me liberty or give me death." The speech became a rallying cry for patriots across America. More and more colonists began believing that armed resistance might now be unavoidable. The following month, General Gage received new orders from London. He was instructed to seize colonial military supplies and arrest patriot leaders before the rebellion could spread further. His attention focused on the small town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. British intelligence reported that patriot militias had hidden large quantities of weapons and ammunition there. If those supplies could be captured, colonial resistance might collapse before it truly began. But the Patriots had built an impressive intelligence network of their own. Supporters inside Boston closely monitored British movements. When Gage's troops prepared to march, riders raced into the countryside carrying urgent warnings. Among them was the silversmith Paul Revere, whose famous midnight ride alerted communities throughout eastern Massachusetts that British soldiers were on the move. Church bells rang. Signal fires appeared across the countryside. Militia companies assembled almost immediately. By the time British troops left Boston, the element of surprise had already been lost. Shortly after midnight on April 19, 1775, approximately 700 British regulars crossed Boston Harbor and began marching toward Concord under the command of Colonel Francis Smith. Their mission was intended to remain completely secret. Instead, hundreds of armed militia members were already waiting. Just before dawn, the British advance guard entered the village of Lexington. Standing on the village green were about 80 militiamen commanded by Captain John Parker. They had no intention of launching an attack. Their purpose was simply to observe the British advance. British officers ordered the militia to disperse. Confused shouting followed. Neither side fully understood what the other intended. Then, somewhere amid the confusion, a single gunshot echoed across the morning air. No one could later agree who fired first. Within seconds, British soldiers unleashed a devastating volley. The militia scattered. 8 Americans lay dead or dying. Only 1 British soldier had been wounded. The confrontation lasted only a few minutes, yet those few minutes changed world history. The skirmish at Lexington marked the opening battle of the American Revolutionary War. The long political struggle between Britain and its colonies had finally erupted into open conflict. There would be no easy return to peace. A nation goes to war April-June 1775. The brief clash at Lexington lasted only a matter of minutes. For the British officers leading the expedition, the mission had not changed. Their objective remained the same: march to Concord, destroy the colonial military supplies hidden there, and return safely to Boston. Believing the scattered militia posed little threat, the British column resumed its advance. What they did not realize was that riders had already spread the alarm across the Massachusetts countryside. With every passing mile, more patriot volunteers grabbed their muskets and hurried toward Concord. The British were marching deeper into territory that was rapidly filling with armed resistance. When British troops finally entered Concord later that morning, they found the town nearly deserted. Most of the military supplies had already been removed or hidden by local patriots after receiving advance warning. British soldiers searched homes, barns, and public buildings, destroying what little ammunition and equipment they discovered. Some gun carriages were burned, a few barrels of flour and military stores were confiscated, but the massive cache of weapons they had hoped to seize was gone. The mission had already failed. Meanwhile, hundreds of militia members gathered on the hills overlooking the town, carefully watching every British movement. Their numbers continued to grow by the minute. The turning point came at the North Bridge. A company of British soldiers had been stationed there to guard the crossing while the main force searched the town. As Patriot militia advanced toward the bridge, confusion quickly spread. Neither side initially wanted to begin another firefight. Then, without warning, shots rang out. The British fired first. Several militia members fell. This time, however, the Americans did not retreat. Colonel James Barrett and Major John Buttrick ordered their men forward. The militia returned fire with disciplined volleys. Caught off guard and heavily outnumbered, the British soldiers abandoned the bridge and withdrew toward Concord. For the first time in the conflict, colonial forces had successfully driven British regulars from the battlefield. News of the victory spread like wildfire. What had begun as scattered resistance was becoming organized military action. Realizing that thousands of militia were converging on the area, Colonel Francis Smith ordered his exhausted troops to begin the march back to Boston. The return journey soon became a nightmare. Rather than confronting the British in open fields, the militia adopted tactics perfectly suited to the New England landscape. They fired from behind stone walls. They attacked from forests. They used houses, fences, and hills as cover before disappearing and striking again from another direction. Every mile of road became another battlefield. The disciplined British army, trained for traditional European warfare, struggled to respond to an enemy that refused to fight according to familiar rules. By afternoon, the retreat had become increasingly desperate. Casualties mounted. Officers fought desperately to maintain order as constant gunfire echoed from both sides of the road. Fortunately for the British, reinforcements under Brigadier General Hugh Percy marched out from Boston with nearly 1,000 fresh troops and several artillery pieces. Percy's arrival prevented complete disaster. His soldiers formed defensive positions that allowed the exhausted expedition to regroup before continuing the retreat. Even so, the danger was far from over. The combined British force still had nearly 16 miles to travel before reaching the safety of Boston. Throughout the afternoon and evening, colonial militia relentlessly harassed the retreating army. The fighting finally ended only after British troops crossed into Charlestown, where Royal Navy warships could provide protection. The cost had been staggering. Britain suffered more than 270 casualties, including soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. Colonial losses were significantly lower, though dozens of patriots had also given their lives. The battles of Lexington and Concord demonstrated a stunning reality. Ordinary colonial militia had stood against one of the most powerful professional armies in the world and survived. Within days, thousands of volunteers from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire surrounded Boston. Rather than launching an immediate assault, they established defensive positions and effectively trapped the British Army inside the city. The siege of Boston had begun. British forces still controlled the harbor, allowing supplies and reinforcements to arrive by sea. On land, however, they found themselves surrounded by an ever-growing colonial army determined to prevent any further expansion. Neither side yet understood how long the conflict would last. Many still believed the fighting might end after a single campaign. History would prove otherwise. In May 1775, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. The situation had changed dramatically since their previous meeting. Now the colonies were not merely protesting British policies. They were actively fighting British soldiers. Congress faced an extraordinary challenge. If the colonies hoped to resist Britain successfully, scattered local militias would not be enough. They needed a unified national army. After weeks of debate, Congress voted to establish the Continental Army. The next question was equally important: who should command it? The delegates selected George Washington of Virginia. The decision carried both military and political significance. Washington had earned valuable combat experience during the French and Indian War and was widely respected for his discipline and leadership. Just as importantly, choosing a Virginian demonstrated that the struggle was not solely a New England rebellion. It belonged to all the colonies. On June 15, 1775, Congress officially appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Accepting the responsibility with humility, Washington admitted that he did not consider himself equal to the enormous task before him. Nevertheless, he pledged to devote everything he possessed to the defense of American liberty. Only days after Washington's appointment, the war intensified once again. British commanders learned that colonial forces were fortifying the high ground overlooking Boston, particularly Breed's Hill and nearby Bunker Hill. If those positions remained in Patriot hands, British ships and troops inside Boston would be dangerously exposed. Determined to eliminate the threat, British General William Howe launched a direct assault on June 17, 1775. Wave after wave of disciplined, red-coated soldiers advanced uphill under heavy colonial fire. The defenders waited patiently until the British came within close range before unleashing devastating volleys. The first attack collapsed. So did the second. Only after the Americans exhausted nearly all of their ammunition did the British finally capture the hill during a third assault. Technically, Britain had won the battle. Strategically, however, the victory came at an enormous cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, an astonishing loss for a single engagement. Colonial casualties were far lower. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that inexperienced American volunteers could stand their ground against Britain's finest professional troops. It shattered the myth of British invincibility and inspired thousands more colonists to join the Patriot cause. By the summer of 1775, the conflict had changed beyond recognition. What began as protests against taxation had evolved into a full-scale war. Both Britain and the colonies still claimed loyalty to King George III, and many continued hoping for reconciliation. Yet, with blood already spilled at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, peaceful compromise was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine. The British Empire and its American colonies now stood on separate paths. The next step would determine whether the colonies sought merely the restoration of their rights or complete independence, holding the line late 1775, early 1776. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that American volunteers could stand against Britain's professional army. But courage alone would not win a war. The Continental Congress now faced an enormous challenge. Thousands of militia had answered the call to arms, yet they lacked training, discipline, ammunition, and reliable leadership. Turning these volunteers into a true national army would require time, something the Patriots could not be certain they possessed. General George Washington arrived outside Boston in the summer of 1775 to take command of the newly formed Continental Army. What he found was both encouraging and alarming. The spirit of the soldiers was undeniable, but the army itself was poorly organized. Different colonies followed different regulations, supplies were inconsistent, and gunpowder was dangerously scarce. Washington quickly realized that a prolonged war would demand far more than enthusiasm. It would require an army capable of standing against the greatest military power on earth. Even as Boston remained under siege, Congress searched for one final peaceful solution. In July 1775, delegates approved what became known as the Olive Branch Petition. The document reaffirmed the colony's loyalty to King George III and pleaded for reconciliation. Congress insisted that Americans had no desire to destroy the British Empire. They asked only that their traditional rights as British subjects be restored. Many delegates still believed that Parliament, not the king, was responsible for the growing crisis. If the king personally intervened, perhaps the conflict could still be resolved without further bloodshed. Their appeal never achieved its goal. King George III refused to consider the petition. Instead, he declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and accused their leaders of attempting to overthrow lawful authority. Any remaining hopes of reconciliation rapidly faded? To many patriots, the message was unmistakable. Britain had chosen war. While Washington tightened the siege around Boston, Congress sought to carry the conflict north into Canada. Many American leaders believed that French-speaking Canadians might welcome liberation from British rule and join the Patriot cause. A northern invasion was organized under General Richard Montgomery. Advancing from Fort Ticonderoga, Montgomery captured several British positions and slowly pushed toward Quebec. At the same time, Colonel Benedict Arnold led a second expedition through hundreds of miles of wilderness. The journey became one of the most exhausting marches of the war. Dense forests, freezing rivers, swamps, hunger, disease, and constant rain devastated Arnold's force before it ever reached its destination. Many soldiers abandoned the expedition. Others died along the way. Those who survived finally reached Quebec exhausted and starving, where they joined Montgomery's army. Together, they numbered barely 1,200 men. Quebec was one of the strongest fortified cities in North America. Its walls overlooked the St. Lawrence River, while experienced British Governor Guy Carleton had prepared carefully for a siege. Knowing that time worked against them, the American commanders decided to launch a surprise assault on December 31, 1775. A fierce snowstorm concealed their advance. Instead of surprise, however, they encountered determined resistance. British defenders held their positions with remarkable discipline. General Montgomery was killed during the attack. Benedict Arnold suffered a serious wound. Hundreds of American soldiers were captured. The assault collapsed into disaster. The dream of bringing Canada into the Revolution had failed. The surviving patriots remained outside Quebec for a short time before eventually retreating. Farther south, the war spread into Virginia. Royal Governor Lord Dunmore attempted to weaken the patriot movement by offering freedom to enslaved people who escaped from rebel-owned plantations and joined British forces. The proclamation attracted hundreds of volunteers within weeks and eventually inspired thousands more to seek freedom behind British lines. For many southern plantation owners, the announcement transformed the conflict. They no longer feared only taxation or political control. Now they feared a widespread slave uprising supported by the British Crown. Instead of weakening resistance, Dunmore's proclamation pushed many previously cautious landowners firmly into the Patriot camp. Winter brought suffering to soldiers on both sides. Outside Boston, Washington's army endured freezing temperatures, shortages of food, clothing, firewood, and ammunition. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded camps. Many enlistments were due to expire at the end of 1775, and exhausted soldiers simply returned home. Within weeks, Washington watched nearly half of his army disappear. He desperately appealed for new recruits while struggling to keep the remaining force together. Despite these hardships, encouraging news occasionally arrived. American privateers captured several British supply ships, including one carrying thousands of muskets and valuable military stores. Every successful capture helped sustain the struggling Continental Army. Meanwhile, a remarkable operation was unfolding hundreds of miles away. Colonel Henry Knox, a 25-year-old former bookseller from Boston, had accepted an almost impossible mission. He would transport the heavy artillery captured earlier at Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. The journey covered nearly 300 miles across frozen rivers, snow-covered mountains, and rugged wilderness. Using sleds pulled by oxen and horses, Knox moved 59 massive cannon, some weighing more than 2 tons. Against extraordinary odds, every cannon reached Washington's army. The achievement became one of the greatest logistical successes of the Revolution. Washington immediately recognized the opportunity. Those guns would soon allow him to threaten the British position in Boston in a way that had never before been possible. The siege was about to enter its decisive phase. The birth of an idea January-June 1776. By the beginning of 1776, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. Months of fighting had transformed the political landscape. British troops had withdrawn from Boston, yet the war itself was only beginning. Across the colonies, many patriots still insisted they were fighting not for independence, but for the restoration of their constitutional rights as British subjects. Even after Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, a complete break from Great Britain remained a radical idea. For countless Americans, the thought of declaring independence seemed both dangerous and unimaginable. After all, they had spent their entire lives as loyal subjects of the British Crown. If reconciliation were still possible, many believed it should be pursued. Everything changed in January 1776. A recently arrived English immigrant named Thomas Paine published a small pamphlet with an ordinary title, Common Sense. Though modest in appearance, its impact would prove extraordinary. Unlike the speeches delivered in Congress or the complex legal arguments written by colonial leaders, Paine spoke directly to ordinary people. His language was simple, his message was bold, and his reasoning challenged assumptions that had shaped colonial society for generations. Paine argued that the conflict was no longer about taxes, trade, or representation. It was about freedom. America, he insisted, had outgrown British rule. Remaining part of the British Empire would only guarantee future conflicts and continued political oppression. The colonies should no longer ask for better treatment. They should become an independent nation. Perhaps Paine's most controversial argument was his attack on monarchy itself. For centuries, many Europeans had accepted kings as a natural part of government. Paine rejected that idea completely. He claimed that hereditary monarchy was irrational, unjust, and contrary to common sense. No family, he argued, possessed a divine right to rule millions of people simply because of birth. Government should exist to protect the rights of its citizens, not to preserve the privileges of a royal dynasty. These ideas shocked many readers. Criticizing Parliament had become increasingly common. Questioning the institution of kingship itself was something entirely different. Yet Paine believed that only by abandoning monarchy could Americans secure lasting liberty. The pamphlets spread through the colonies with astonishing speed. Printers worked day and night to produce new copies. Merchants carried it from port to port, travelers shared it in taverns, churches, marketplaces, and military camps. Many who could not read gathered while neighbors read the pamphlet aloud. Within only a few months, Common Sense had become one of the most widely circulated publications in American history. Its influence reached every level of society. Farmers discussed its arguments in rural villages. Artisans debated its ideas in busy workshops. Merchants quoted its passages in coffee houses. Even soldiers carried copies with them as they prepared for battle. For thousands of Americans, Paine gave words to thoughts they had never before dared to express. Not everyone agreed. Loyalists condemned the pamphlet as reckless propaganda designed to destroy the British Empire. They argued that Britain remained the strongest military and naval power in the world. Declaring independence, they warned, would invite economic collapse, foreign invasion, and endless war. Many ordinary colonists shared these concerns. Breaking away from Britain meant abandoning the protection of the Royal Navy, risking their livelihoods, and confronting an uncertain future. Independence offered hope. It also carried enormous risks. The debate divided families, neighbors, and entire communities. Inside the Second Continental Congress, opinions were equally divided. Delegates from different colonies held very different views. Some believed reconciliation was still possible. Others argued that every attempt at compromise had failed. Among the strongest advocates for independence was John Adams of Massachusetts. Adams believed recent events had made Britain's intentions unmistakably clear. The king had rejected peaceful petitions. British armies continued fighting American citizens. To Adams, the colonies were already at war with Britain. The only question remaining was whether they would admit it openly. Adams tirelessly worked to persuade hesitant delegates that independence was no longer a choice driven by emotion. It had become a political necessity. Another influential voice came from Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. Supported by leaders in his home colony, Lee believed the time had finally arrived to make a decisive break. Virginia had become increasingly convinced that reconciliation was impossible. If America hoped to secure foreign allies, raise loans, and organize an effective national government, it first needed to declare itself an independent nation. Without independence, France and other European powers would hesitate to support what still appeared to be an internal British rebellion. The argument carried tremendous weight. Military victory would require international assistance. Diplomatic recognition could not come before political independence. Even delegates who privately favored independence understood the seriousness of the decision before them. Declaring independence meant far more than issuing a political statement. It meant openly accusing the British Crown of tyranny. It meant risking execution for treason if the revolution failed. Every delegate knew the consequences. If Britain won the war, those who signed such a declaration could lose their property, their freedom, or even their lives. The decision required extraordinary courage. Outside the halls of Congress, public opinion continued shifting. Colonial assemblies increasingly instructed their delegates to support independence. Town meetings passed resolutions calling for complete separation from Britain. Local newspapers echoed the arguments first introduced by Thomas Paine. One by one, the colonies abandoned hopes of reconciliation. The movement that had begun as resistance to taxation had evolved into something much greater. Americans were no longer asking what rights they possessed as British subjects. They were asking what kind of nation they wished to create. By the summer of 1776, the answer was becoming increasingly clear. The colonies stood on the threshold of history. Their next decision would change the world forever. Soon, the Continental Congress would vote on a resolution unlike any ever proposed in British America. If approved, 13 colonies would cease to exist. In their place would rise a new nation, one founded not upon loyalty to a king, but upon the belief that the people themselves possessed the right to govern their own future. The moment of independence had arrived. the declaration that changed the world, June-July 1776. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies had reached a point of no return. Months of debate, failed negotiations, and open warfare had convinced many colonial leaders that reconciliation with Great Britain was no longer possible. British armies continued to fight across North America, while King George III refused to recognize the Continental Congress or negotiate with its representatives. The question before Congress was no longer whether conflict existed. The question was whether the colonies would officially declare themselves free and independent states. It would become one of the most consequential political decisions in human history. On June 7, 1776, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee rose before the Second Continental Congress and introduced a bold resolution. He declared that the United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The proposal immediately sparked intense debate. Some delegates believed the time had finally come to sever all ties with Britain. Others feared the colonies were moving too quickly. Several argued that America was still unprepared for complete independence. The Continental Army lacked supplies. The war had only just begun. Without foreign allies, defeating Britain would be extraordinarily difficult. Yet supporters of independence answered with a powerful argument. No European nation would openly support colonies that still claimed loyalty to the British Crown. If America hoped to secure military aid, especially from France, it first needed to become an independent nation. The debate continued for days. Eventually, Congress agreed to postpone the final vote for several weeks, giving hesitant colonies time to instruct their delegates. Meanwhile, preparations quietly began for what many believed would soon become inevitable, even before independence had been approved. Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration explaining the colonies' decision to the world. The committee became known as the Committee of Five. Its members represented some of the brightest political minds in America. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. Although every member contributed ideas, the responsibility for writing the first draft fell to the youngest among them, Thomas Jefferson. At only 33 years old, Jefferson possessed a remarkable talent for political writing. John Adams later explained that Jefferson was chosen because of his elegant style, respected reputation, and ability to express complex ideas with extraordinary clarity. Jefferson accepted the task knowing that every word could shape the future of an entire nation. Working largely alone in a rented room in Philadelphia, Jefferson spent days carefully drafting the document. Rather than writing only a declaration of political separation, he sought to explain the philosophical foundation upon which a new nation would stand. Drawing inspiration from Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, Jefferson argued that all people possess natural rights that no government could legitimately take away. Governments, he wrote, existed only because the people consented to their authority. Whenever a government became destructive to those rights, the people possessed the right and even the duty to replace it. These ideas were revolutionary. Instead of claiming that rulers received authority from God, Jefferson argued that legitimate government derived its power from the governed themselves. The people, not kings, were the true source of political authority. Perhaps no sentence in American history has become more famous than the opening principles Jefferson included near the beginning of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words expressed ideals that would inspire democratic movements around the world for generations to come. Although the reality of 18th century America often fell far short of these principles, the ideals themselves established a powerful standard against which future generations would judge their nation. The Declaration then presented a long list of grievances against King George III, accusing him of repeatedly violating the rights of the American people. According to Congress, the king had dissolved representative assemblies, obstructed justice, maintained standing armies without consent, imposed taxes without representation, restricted colonial trade, and used military force against his own subjects. Taken together, these accusations formed the legal and moral justification for independence. Once Jefferson completed his draft, the Committee of Five carefully reviewed every section. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin suggested numerous revisions. Some sentences were rewritten for greater clarity. Others were shortened or strengthened. Franklin, famous for his wit and careful editing, refined several passages without changing Jefferson's central message. After the committee finished its work, the revised draft was presented to the Continental Congress. There, delegates spent several days debating nearly every paragraph. Certain passages were modified, others were removed entirely. One of the most significant deletions involved Jefferson's criticism of the transatlantic slave trade, a section that faced strong opposition from delegates representing colonies where slavery remained deeply rooted. The editing process demonstrated that the Declaration was not the work of one man alone. It was the product of collective debate, compromise, and shared political purpose. Finally, on July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. John Adams believed that this date would forever be celebrated as America's true day of independence. He later wrote that future generations would commemorate it with parades, fireworks, public celebrations, and joyful ceremonies. History chose a different date. Over the next 2 days, Congress completed its final revisions to the Declaration. Then, on July 4, 1776, the delegates officially approved the completed document. The United States Declaration of Independence was born. For the first time, the 13 colonies publicly declared themselves to be free and independent states. No longer subject to the authority of the British Crown, it was an act of extraordinary courage. If the revolution failed, every man who supported the Declaration could be tried for high treason, a crime punishable by death. Yet the delegates accepted that risk. As Benjamin Franklin reportedly remarked, they would all have to hang together, or they would surely hang separately. Copies of the Declaration were quickly printed and distributed throughout the colonies. It was read aloud in city squares, churches, military camps, and town meetings. Crowds gathered to hear its words. Church bells rang. Bonfires illuminated the night sky. Statues and symbols of royal authority were torn down in many communities. For patriots, the Declaration represented far more than political independence. It announced the birth of a new nation founded upon liberty, popular sovereignty, and the belief that governments existed to serve their people. Not everyone celebrated. Thousands of loyalists remained faithful to Britain and regarded the Declaration as an act of dangerous rebellion. For them, the colonies had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Both sides now understood that compromise was effectively impossible. The struggle was no longer about reforming the British Empire. It had become a war to decide whether the United States of America would survive. The Declaration had changed the purpose of the Revolution forever. The colonies were no longer fighting merely to defend their rights. They were fighting to preserve the independence they had just proclaimed before the world, turning the tide of war 1776 to 1781. The Declaration of Independence transformed the American Revolution. Before July 1776, the colonies had fought to defend what they believed were their rights as British subjects. Now they fought for something far greater, the survival of an entirely new nation. For Britain, the conflict was no longer a colonial rebellion that could be negotiated away. It had become a war to crush American independence before it could inspire similar movements throughout the empire. Both sides understood that the struggle had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. British leaders believed the rebellion could still be ended with one overwhelming military campaign. Their strategy focused on capturing New York City, the largest port in the colonies and one of the most important commercial centers in North America. Control of New York would split New England from the southern colonies, isolate the heart of the Patriot movement, and provide the Royal Navy with an excellent base of operations. In the summer of 1776, a massive British fleet arrived in New York Harbor carrying more than 30 soldiers under the command of General William Howe. It was the largest overseas military expedition Britain had ever launched. Facing them stood George Washington and the inexperienced Continental Army. The Americans fought with determination, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The Battle of Long Island ended in a crushing Patriot defeat. Washington's army narrowly escaped destruction only because of a daring nighttime evacuation across the East River under the cover of darkness and heavy fog. One by one, the British captured Manhattan and forced the Continental Army into a long retreat across New Jersey. Morale collapsed. Thousands of soldiers deserted. Many believed the revolution was nearing its end. Washington understood that defeat on the battlefield did not necessarily mean defeat in the war. His greatest objective became preserving the Continental Army. As long as his army survived, the revolution remained alive. If it were destroyed, American independence would disappear with it. Retreat after retreat frustrated many patriots, but Washington refused to gamble everything on one decisive battle. Instead, he waited patiently for an opportunity. That opportunity arrived during one of the darkest moments of the Revolution. On the freezing night of December 25, 1776, Washington launched one of the boldest operations in American military history. Leading approximately 2,400 soldiers, he crossed the ice-filled Delaware River during a fierce winter storm. The journey was slow and dangerous. Boats struggled against the current. Snow and freezing rain battered the exhausted troops. Several artillery pieces nearly sank before reaching the opposite shore. Yet by dawn, Washington's army was advancing toward the town of Trenton, where a garrison of Hessian soldiers, German troops fighting for Britain, believed they were safe for the holiday season. The surprise attack was swift and decisive. More than 900 Hessians were captured with minimal American losses. The victory electrified the colonies. After months of retreat and disappointment, the Patriots finally had reason to believe that victory remained possible. Only days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force before withdrawing safely into winter quarters. The Revolution had survived its greatest crisis. The following year, Britain adopted a new strategy. Military planners hoped to isolate rebellious New England by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada while other British armies advanced northward to meet him. Together, they would cut the colonies in two. The plan looked impressive on paper. In reality, poor communication and conflicting priorities doomed it from the beginning. As Burgoyne pushed through the forests of northern New York, his army encountered determined American resistance. Trees were felled across roads. Bridges were destroyed. Supplies became increasingly scarce. Every mile forward grew more difficult than the last. By autumn 1777, Burgoyne found himself surrounded near the town of Saratoga. American forces under General Horatio Gates, supported by the aggressive leadership of Benedict Arnold, repeatedly attacked the exhausted British army. Cut off from reinforcements and running out of food, Burgoyne had little choice. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers. It became the greatest American victory of the war up to that point. The Battle of Saratoga proved that the Continental Army could defeat a major British field army. Its significance extended far beyond the battlefield. Across Europe, governments watched the revolution with growing interest. Now, for the first time, the American cause appeared capable of succeeding. No nation followed the events at Saratoga more closely than France. Ever since losing much of its North American empire during the 7 Years' War, France had searched for an opportunity to weaken Britain. The American Revolution presented exactly that chance. Until Saratoga, however, French leaders had hesitated. Supporting a failed rebellion would bring enormous risks. A convincing American victory changed everything. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States and signed an alliance with the new republic. The agreement transformed the conflict. What had begun as a colonial rebellion now became an international war. French money strengthened the struggling American economy. French weapons supplied the Continental Army. French officers, including the young Marquis de Lafayette, served alongside Washington's soldiers. Most importantly, the powerful French Navy challenged Britain's control of the seas. Britain now faced enemies across Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and North America. Its military resources were stretched thinner than ever before. Despite French assistance, the war remained long and difficult. British commanders shifted their attention southward, believing that thousands of loyalists in Georgia and the Carolinas would rally to the crown. They captured Savannah in 1778 and seized Charleston in 1780, inflicting one of the worst defeats suffered by the Continental Army. Fighting across the South became especially brutal. Small battles, surprise attacks, and guerrilla warfare replaced traditional set-piece engagements. Leaders such as Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan, and Francis Marion steadily wore down British forces through relentless campaigns of maneuver and attrition. Although Britain won several tactical victories, each success came at a heavy cost. Holding conquered territory proved far more difficult than capturing it. The longer the war continued, the more Britain's strength declined. In 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis established a fortified position at Yorktown, Virginia, believing the nearby coast would allow the Royal Navy to support his army whenever necessary. Instead, events unfolded in Britain's worst possible way. Washington recognized an extraordinary opportunity. Rather than attacking British forces elsewhere, he secretly marched the Continental Army south from New York while French troops under Comte Rochambeau joined the advance. At the same time, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. In September 1781, French warships defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing British reinforcements from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis suddenly found himself trapped. American and French forces surrounded the town on land. The French Navy controlled the sea. Escape had become impossible. For weeks, Allied artillery relentlessly bombarded British defenses. One defensive position after another fell into American hands. Food supplies dwindled. Casualties mounted. Every day weakened Cornwallis's chances of survival. Finally, on October 19, 1781, the British commander surrendered more than 7,000 soldiers to the combined American and French armies. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended major military operations in North America. Church bells rang throughout the United States. Celebrations erupted across the new nation. After years of sacrifice, the Patriots had achieved the victory that once seemed impossible. Yet, the revolution was not officially over. Peace negotiations still lay ahead. Britain remained a global superpower, and the legal recognition of American independence had not yet been secured. The fighting had largely ended. The diplomacy was only beginning. The final chapter of the American Revolution would determine whether military victory could be transformed into lasting peace and whether the United States would finally take its place among the independent nations of the world. A new nation and a new era 1781-1783 and beyond. The surrender of General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781 marked the decisive military turning point of the American Revolution. Although scattered fighting continued in several parts of the British Empire, the outcome of the war had become increasingly difficult to deny. Britain still possessed one of the world's most powerful armies and the greatest navy on Earth. Yet, after years of costly warfare stretching across North America, Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and India, many British leaders concluded that continuing the conflict would bring little reward. Victory, once considered inevitable, had become politically and financially unsustainable. The British government began searching for a path toward peace. News of Yorktown sent shock waves through Britain. When reports reached London, members of Parliament openly questioned the government's strategy. Public support for the war weakened rapidly. Prime Minister Lord North, who had overseen Britain's wartime policy for much of the conflict, reportedly exclaimed that the defeat meant everything was lost. Soon afterward, his government collapsed. A new ministry entered office with a different objective. Rather than seeking another costly campaign in America, it opened negotiations with the United States. The battlefield had demonstrated what diplomacy would soon confirm. The colonies could no longer be brought back under British rule by force. Peace negotiations began in Paris, where representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and Spain gathered to determine the future of North America. The American delegation included three of the Revolution's most respected leaders: Benjamin Franklin, whose diplomatic skill had secured the crucial alliance with France; John Adams, one of the earliest and strongest advocates for independence; and John Jay, an experienced statesman determined to protect the interests of the new republic. Although France had been America's wartime ally, American negotiators carefully pursued their own national objectives. Their goal was clear: to secure not only peace, but complete international recognition of the United States as a sovereign nation. Months of difficult discussions followed. Every border, trading right, and territorial claim became the subject of intense negotiation. On September 3, 1783, the two sides signed the Treaty of Paris. Its terms reshaped the political map of North America. Most importantly, Great Britain formally recognized the United States of America as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. The 13 former colonies were no longer subjects of the British Crown. They had become an independent country under international law. The treaty also granted the United States an enormous territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, while its northern boundary was established with British Canada and its southern border with Spanish Florida. American fishermen received valuable rights in the waters off Newfoundland, and both nations agreed to restore peace and exchange prisoners of war. For the United States, the treaty represented the fulfillment of the promise first proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence 7 years earlier. For Britain, it marked the loss of one of the most important parts of its empire. Military victory, however, solved only one challenge. Building a nation proved far more difficult than winning a revolution. The United States emerged from the war burdened with heavy debts, a weak central government, and an uncertain economy. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress possessed limited authority. It could request money from the states but had little power to enforce its decisions. Each state guarded its own independence, often placing local interests above national unity. Many leaders worried that the fragile republic might collapse before it truly began. These concerns eventually led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where delegates drafted a new constitution designed to create a stronger federal government while protecting individual liberties. 2 years later, George Washington became the first president of the United States, helping establish traditions that would shape the young republic for generations. The American Revolution transformed more than a single nation. It reshaped political thought around the world. For centuries, monarchy had dominated European politics. The success of the American Revolution demonstrated that governments could derive their authority not from kings or inherited privilege, but from the consent of the people. The principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence inspired reformers, philosophers, and revolutionaries across the globe. Only a few years later, similar ideas influenced the French Revolution, where demands for liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty challenged another ancient monarchy. In Latin America, leaders such as Simon Bolivar later drew inspiration from the American example while leading movements against Spanish colonial rule. Across Europe and beyond, constitutional government, representative institutions, and the language of natural rights gained increasing influence during the 19th century. The revolution had become an international symbol of self-government. Yet the revolution also left many of its greatest promises unfulfilled. The Declaration proclaimed that all people were created equal, but slavery remained legal throughout much of the United States. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans continued living in bondage despite the ideals of liberty celebrated by the new republic. Women played vital roles throughout the revolution by managing farms, supporting the army, producing supplies, and maintaining communities. Yet they remained excluded from political participation. Native American nations suffered devastating consequences as American settlement expanded westward into lands they had inhabited for generations. For many indigenous communities, American independence marked the beginning of a long period of displacement, conflict, and loss. The revolution opened extraordinary opportunities for some while creating profound hardships for others. Its legacy would continue to evolve through future generations. Looking back, it is remarkable how the conflict began. The revolution did not start with a demand for independence. It began with arguments over taxation, representation, and constitutional rights within the British Empire. Few colonists in the early 1760s imagined creating an entirely new nation. Yet each failed compromise, each political crisis, and each battle gradually pushed Britain and its American colonies farther apart. From the protests against the Stamp Act to the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, from the courage displayed at Saratoga to the triumph at Yorktown, the revolution unfolded through countless decisions made by ordinary citizens as well as extraordinary leaders. The future of the United States was shaped not by a single battle or one famous document, but by years of sacrifice, perseverance, and determination. More than 2 centuries later, the American Revolution remains one of the defining events in modern history. It established the first enduring republic born from Enlightenment principles and demonstrated that a colonial people could successfully challenge one of the world's greatest empires. Its ideas influenced constitutions, inspired democratic movements, and reshaped debates about liberty, government, and human rights across continents. The revolution was not perfect. Its promises were not immediately fulfilled. But its central belief that legitimate government exists to serve its people and derives its authority from their consent continues to shape political thought around the world today. The road to independence ended with the birth of a nation. Its legacy, however, is still being written.